welcome everybody. I am delighted to have on my Family Troubles podcast therapist Sasha Ayad. She is an author and one of the most prominent voices examining the intersection of gender identity, family relationships, and adolescent mental health. Sasha has worked extensively with parents, navigating some of the truly most challenging and emotionally charged conversations of our time, helping families stay connected even when they disagree about deeply important issues. She's the co-author of When Kids Say They're Trans and board member of Therapy First for parents, therapists whose orientation is improving mental health services for those with gender dysphoria. Welcome, Sasha. I had Sasha at my recent conference in Tahoe for Estranged Mothers, and she was a big hit. And I know she'll be a big hit on the podcast as well. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Josh. I'm so glad to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Good. So I'm kind of curious because you're much more on top of these issues than I am. Like, what's kind of the current state of thinking about teens and young adults who are transitioning? It seems like, I don't know whether there's actually been a slowdown or reported slowdown, both here and in other countries, and I don't know how much of that is in response to, what happens in the current administration. But if you were to give sort of a state of the union in terms of all that, what would you say? Start with a nice easy question.
Well, one of the funny things, I've been working in the field of gender issues and adolescent gender dysphoria for about 10 years. And often I am asked, like, if you had to make a prediction about what's happening or what's coming down the pipeline, because this is anyone who looks into this will realize this is a rapidly moving, pretty chaotic area of mental health. And what I've learned over the years is that I really suck at these predictions. So I can't tell you, I don't have a clear sense of like the numbers and all of that. But what I can say is that the field, I think, has gone through a lot of whiplashing back and forth about how to best serve these young people. And I think where we're at now is, clinicians, doctors, mental health professionals, teachers, schools are starting to recognize that this is actually an area that requires for all of us to really slow down and try to understand what these kids are going through, what is going on perhaps a little bit behind the surface story. How do we balance affirming them and making sure they feel heard and safe with also trying to exhibit some caution, because we're dealing with pretty high stakes interventions here when it comes to transition and medical stuff. So I think as a field, we are starting to grapple with the consequential nature of how we approach this and not really taking very blanket approaches. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of things about the Trump administration have been handled very insensitively, and that creates understandably some anxieties and some backlash ideas. So none of that is great. But I do think a lot of clinicians and professionals are realizing, okay, this is a really complicated issue and we need to slow down and handle it with care.
Yeah. And what about the recent the findings in the UK? I'm forgetting the name of that big study that was done that sort of encouraged a much more slow approach. What was
I think you're talking about there's a Finnish study recently that showed that when it comes to mental health outcomes for young people who are pursuing a medical pathway, like females taking testosterone, for example, to masculinize themselves, or, boys taking T blockers and estrogen, that the mental health outcomes are not necessarily better. And I think, for many years here in the US, the push has been, hey, we need to, affirm these kids medically. It's called, gender affirming medical care, because that will improve the mental health outcomes. And what we're seeing as more time passes and we have more long-term studies and studies with better methodology is that's really not clear at all, actually. So when you have, such a high stakes interventions that cause issues with like fertility and permanent changes and health consequences, you really do have to slow down, especially if the data doesn't support that this is kind of like in the bag, uncontroversial. We have to slow down and be careful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think so many parents were kind of rushed to the medical affirming care because of this one study that showed that if you don't, your kid's going to kill yourself. So it seems like a lot of parents were, showing up to a clinic with their children and being told, well, you can either have a dead kid or an alive kid who's going to transition. Which would you choose, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's unfortunately been kind of like a one-liner, which totally shuts down curiosity, intuition on the parent's part. I mean, that's devastating. If a parent has a kid who's going through a lot of mental health challenges, because that's usually
Yeah.
the case, like this gender
Uh-huh.
dysphoria usually comes, as a co-occurring condition with other things. So your kid's
Mm.
already been really struggling. If you hear a physician tell you, it's either this or, suicide, it's almost a no-brainer. Parents will be terrified and put in a position where they just do whatever the provider suggests.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
even in a recent court case, Scrimetti, which went to Supreme Court, one of the most prominent trans activists even admitted that that's not true. Like that statistic is misused. There's
Mm.
no direct correlation between, affirming and preventing suicide, and there's no direct correlation between, you know, questioning one's identity and suicide. I mean, there are mental health issues, there are suicidal ideations, but the way that has been presented is just really, really misleading.
Yeah.
So, yes, a lot of parents that I have encountered in my practice were kind of going through a mental health crisis with their kid. They took them to a gender clinic thinking, oh, well, this seems like the place where you would go to help resolve gender
Right.
issues.
Yeah. Right.
But what they discover, I mean, parents will often share this with me, and I've been also an expert witness on a lot of court cases. Gender
Mm.
clinics, in many cases, operate as kind of like a one direction pathway. They're not
Hmm.
really there to resolve or kind of pick through the granular issues or work on broad mental health. They're really there to affirm the trans identity and medicalize the young people. And
Yeah.
so when they get to the gender clinics and they say things like that, like, would you rather have a live son or dead daughter? I mean, they
Right.
feel, I mean, in hindsight, a lot of times they'll say, I felt bullied, I felt
Hmm.
pressured, I felt threatened, I felt like when I asked reasonable questions about, is this safe? I'm worried that this may be something my kid regrets. I was treated as a bigot. I was treated like I wasn't being supportive. So,
Right.
under those kinds of pressures, it's really hard for parents to like find their footing and, tune in with their very reasonable intuitive concerns about
Yeah.
a pathway that seems consequential, out of the blue. Maybe it feels like it's part of a mental health issue that their kids are going through. So, yes, lots of families have felt really pushed into that approach when maybe they felt some skepticism on the inside.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's at this moment, parents are really becoming kind of disempowered because of people in our field, the therapists, and to some extent the medical professionals, because there's a sort of a prejudice, which doesn't sound like a prejudice, but a push to believe the child. And somehow, if you don't
Yeah.
believe the child, I mean, I see this a lot with adult children who say I was traumatized, and the parent was like, no, actually, you weren't traumatized, and the therapist is going to, of course, say, well, I'm going to believe my client, which is fine. It's kind of what we therapists should do, but there is such a thing as an objective truth in the same way that medically there are objective truths. And so we as a society have handed over so much power to therapists in particular in ways that really disempowers parents and sort of sets them up for an estrangement. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well, the estrangement piece in your work. I know you have some, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of something I shared when we were in Lake Tahoe because I knew a lot of the parents wouldn't be so familiar with my work, but I I came to work with so much estrangement because it is a really common dynamic that you see in families where a kid is struggling with identity or gender dysphoria or things along those lines. And I think one of the challenges here that I see, and I think this extends beyond just the stuff around estrangement or gender, is that we're really struggling to kind of operationally define things. Like if a kid comes to a clinician and says, I was traumatized by my parents, I mean, there are a whole series of questions that I think are clinically appropriate to be asking. Like, tell me a little
Absolutely.
more what you mean. If I were a fly on the wall, take me through that conversation. What did your parents say? Then what did you say? What was their, tone of voice? Were they throwing objects? I mean, like, these are legitimate questions
Right.
because, I mean, part of what we're seeing is, in my opinion, there's kind of a confluence of things. I think a lot of the young people that are in my practice, struggling with gender, and a lot of young adults that I've met or parents who I've met who are estranged, I think they tend to have some kind of like temperamental or personality characteristics that do make them perhaps more sensitive to, interpreting disagreements or parental conflicts with them, like parent-child conflicts, as being really, really abrasive. A lot of the kids, at least in my practice, they have some kind of neurodivergence. They may have ADHD, they may have autism, they may have sensory processing issues. And so a lot of times, especially if a family has multiple children, I always like to ask, like, was your sister affected in the same way by your parents? Or I'll ask parents, how do your other kids respond to your parenting style? And that gives us some clues, again, kind of operationally defining, like, what's actually going on here about the temperament and how that impacts it. So, that's kind of one of the traits that I see. These kids tend to be a little bit more sensitive. I often say they have strong feelers. They may perceive very subtle, like if a parent's a little bit aggravated or kind of annoyed, they might perceive that in a way that lands very strongly on them. Whereas maybe the sibling is like, blow it off, like mom's in a bad mood, I don't care, doing whatever. Right. So there's that. And then when it comes to what have you seen around that? Because I noticed totally. That even in our retreat, lots of parents reported that their kids have kind of had a history of being really, really temperamentally volatile. So what do you think?
Well, I think mental illness certainly is a factor and a vector in estrangement because of the ways that it sort of distorts the motivation and the interpretation of the parent's behavior or the family relationships. But I think the point that you're making is that temperamental differences might not be full-blown mental health. It just might be oversensitivity or just highly sensitive or being on the spectrum, all those things. And when we all sort of filter our experience of other people, family in particular, through the lens of our own largely inherited temperamental defensive mechanisms. So if we come into the world with an oppositional defiant disorder, we're probably going to, fight more with our parents. If we come into the world with, avoidant anxiety disorder or something like that, we're going to experience people as being much more provocative, et cetera. So those lenses are hugely important. And I think in both of our work, we both have emphasized that if you're the parent trying to respond to that, getting into the rightness or the wrongness of it will never carry the day because your kid experienced what they experienced. If they experienced you as abusive and the other kids are like saying, oh, that's ridiculous. But that kid did. You're not going to convince them by saying, well, your sister doesn't feel like that. And she was there. You have to actually get into that. What was it about that behavior? Show curiosity and interest because that is the world that they experienced you in. So
yeah, well, that kind of touches on another thing that I see, which is there's a lot of black and white thinking, and we can definitely loop in some of the cultural narratives that encourage that rigidity. But black and white thinking is also something that in some cases is temperamental. Like some people will say, my kid sees the world in this very black and white way, like you're a good guy or you're a bad guy. And so when we think about, what makes a young person feel quote unquote supported in the family, in any normal family dynamic, there are going to be moments where as a child, you do feel kind of guilty. Maybe your parents, got mad at you for having done something and you feel guilty, and guilty is a not pleasant feeling. So does that mean bad? Like, does that mean something bad has happened? And how do we interpret that? How do we make sense of that? How do we synthesize that? And, sometimes, in the family dynamic, the repair is almost more important than the context of what happened. And so if a family's maybe not so thoughtful about that, or maybe they haven't in every single instance of disruption, they haven't repaired until things are back to baseline, like, that can build up in the mind of a black and white thinker as maybe this was a pattern of some sort of like, intimidation, or I don't know how they frame it. So black and white thinking and sensitivity, I think, are common traits that we see in both gender stuff and estrangement stuff. And someone listening to this who's not very familiar with the gender stuff may be like, wait a minute, what in the world does gender nonconformity have to do with black and white thinking and sensitivity? And, there's a big change in the way these young people who are struggling with gender present these days. And many of them present with gender identity concerns for the first time in their teenage years. after having a very unremarkable childhood related
Yeah.
to gender and gender
Mm-hmm.
presentation, and in the context of a lot of, quote unquote, research about gender identity and learning about what might it mean to have dysphoria or be trans. And very similarly to, I think, a lot of parents of estranged kids, they come across certain ideas that help shape their interpretation of distress, of family
Yeah.
conflict, of what does it mean that that one time after, Halloween, I didn't want to take off that joke princess dress costume that I wore as a boy. Like things like that can get reimagined and reinterpreted. And, it might be strange to think about, but a lot of kids that I work with in my practice only really came to think of themselves as trans after having spent inordinate amounts of time kind of ruminating on these ideas and these philosophies and these theories, a lot of time during COVID, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're embedded in a peer group that also tells you family support, it only means immediately agreeing with your
Right.
gender identity claim, immediately getting on board with whatever medical steps you want to take. And anything that questions you, or any parent who asks kind of questions or has some doubts or skepticism, that's bad. That's not supportive.
Right.
So you're back in kind of a black and white thinking. So black and white thinking can come from a temperamental side, and it can also come from a lot of the cultural messages that are embedded in some of these communities and spaces.
Yeah, no, no question. I think it's all really well said. Yeah, the other way that I think about that, Sasha, is that in this moment, younger generations, for a variety of reasons, have more anxiety, right? I mean, Gen X has, or not Gen X, but Gen Z, those were between 1995 and 2012. They have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and suicide. And so finding a reason for that, they're all really hungry for it, and they're spending enormous amount of times online, and they're socially isolated, and they're hungry for a community. So finding your tribe, finding your group of people, particularly if you've been a little bit, not, I mean, clearly not all kids who are transition, have gender identity issues felt socially isolated or outcast in some ways. But if you did, finding a group of people who are like, you go, yes, you're doing the courageous thing. That's a really assertive, self-empowering thing to do. That can be incredibly exciting because then you feel like you belong. But the other part of the black and white thinking is one of the things about black and white thinking is that it's a less anxiety ridden place to be. Part of what causes us to be anxious is to not really know, to be uncertain, to be ambivalent. And it takes a certain amount of psychological health to be ambivalent. And I think a certain number of estrangements come from ambivalent feelings that, well, I love this about my parents, but I hate this about them, but wow, it's a lot easier to just kind of hate them in a certain way and reject them. And so I think the black and white thinking stems in many ways because of the anxiety. And if you do have gender dysphoria, you're going to have anxiety because it's such a confusing place to live, right?
That's such a good point, because I mean this difficulty with ambivalence is also, really common in some of the neurodivergent kids that we see,
I bet.
who struggle with this. And there's so much about human existence which is very gray area. I mean, even, with gender, I believe very
Yeah.
much that we all embody some traits that are more on the masculine side and more on the feminine side. And, in this highly digital world we live in, that tends to be reimagined as something very literal. Like masculine means facial hair and feminine means curves in the body. I'm talking more almost about like energetically, for lack, not wanting to sound woo woo, but we all have
Yeah.
moments where we feel a little more, you know, um, tough and stoic and
Hmm.
dry and assertive, and then other moments where we feel really intuitive and sensitive and nurturing. Those are masculine and feminine traits, and they're not
Hmm.
black and white at all. I mean,
No, right.
and you talk to any guy who's even like, a boomer or a different generation, ask him moments about his childhood where he felt ambivalent about his masculinity. Stories abound, right?
Mhm. Oh,
But
no
the
question. Yeah.
interpretation of those is,
Right.
flexible. It's like, well, it took me some time to figure out like what kind of a guy I am. And I felt really bullied by this one group of boys because they were really macho. I mean, all of that in today's context is just interpreted as gender dysphoria, which means you were
Yeah.
born in the wrong body and you need to
Right.
transition.
Yeah.
So that
Well,
is
well,
really
tomboys too, right?
unfortunate. Oh,
Right. I mean,
yeah.
when I was
Yeah.
growing up, a tomboy. I mean, I don't know what to think of it as a term, but the idea was that there were girls who were much more athletic and much more edgy and pushy and aggressive, and many of them probably went on to become lesbians, and many of them probably didn't.
Yep.
But
Yep.
now they would be told that they're actually in the wrong body, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a really interesting and I think important social controversy that a lot of even college students that I work with, they say like if you go to the, pride club at university, there's like no gay people left there. It's mostly gender identity,
Yeah.
kids. And that's there's a whole controversy in the lesbian community about butch women sort of disappearing. I mean, that's not really the direction
Right.
our podcast is going, but there
It's
are
interesting.
implications when we start interpreting gender stuff in very rigid ways. We do lose some of that granularity and like variety of how people understand these like, existential aspects of soft and hard elements in people's personality. So
Right.
that's probably not the direction we want to go, but there's a lot to talk about
Okay,
with
there's
estrangement.
right. There's plenty of directions, and it's probably worth our saying that I don't. It's neither of our positions that there aren't people who do transition and are happier, and there's plenty of cultures in the world where they recognize multiple gender identities beyond male, traditional male and female. So it isn't. Neither of us are saying, because I know you're writing as well, Sasha. Neither of us are saying, well, that's anybody who does this is pursuing a pathology, right?
No, not at all. And I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's the thing. There are lots of people that I've met who, have transitioned and feel really satisfied that it really alleviated a lot of the kind of concrete aspects of their dysphoria. And at the same time, some of the cultural narratives that are oversimplified about gender and transition, even people who are very happy with their transitions can look at our current cultural narratives and say, that seems overly simplified, or my experience was actually much more complex than that. Not to say that it was bad or good or worse or better, but whenever we have cultural narratives that are overly simplistic, we miss all of the complexity of real human experiences, including people who are very happy to have transitioned.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what happens when a person's identity becomes organized around a narrative of being victimized and diagnosed and separated from family? How do you think about that? Because it seems like whether it's gender identity or estrangement, it seems like younger generations are a bit more prone to both having a diagnosis. In one study I read said that something like 40%, I think it was of young women, feel really identified with their diagnosis. Is like that's the most important part of who they are. How do you
In
think that
general, like, do you mean diagnoses in general?
psychiatric? I mean, I meant psychiatric, but I would probably add gender identity into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's an interesting relationship, I think, happening between diagnoses and whether or not someone is a victim. Like, there's been a shift, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, but there was a long time where in the mental health profession, having a certain label or diagnosis, especially a mental health one, was very stigmatizing, and
for sure.
it really
Yeah.
did put, it was kind of an embarrassing thing. You would not talk about it with others. And that was a really difficult place to be if you are a patient earnestly trying to struggle with a mental health condition.
For sure.
And I think rightly, there have been a lot of almost patient advocacy groups and maybe some more awareness in the psychiatric and mental health community that that's not helpful, like to kind of stigmatize people.
Right.
So in the effort to kind of correct that dynamic, I think there has now been like this weird sense of like, not only is my label something we shouldn't stigmatize, but sometimes it's something that I want to wear really, really proudly as a massive aspect of my identity.
Right.
And then if it stopped there, I think, okay, that sounds actually fine. But what ends up happening is it almost twists around and says, well, because I have this diagnosis or this label, I've been oppressed by the mental health community for so long, or I've been stigmatized by so and so person that now I'm a victim. So it's
Right.
this, I think it's this weird like tug of war between, are you proud of your mental health condition and are you genuinely like holding it in a way that is like, I feel good about who I am? Or do you still feel really oppressed by it and you still have to lash out at everyone who's like oppressing you? So, you know, I'm not really asking a question about whether or
Right.
not that interpretation is literally correct, but I am interested in how people seem to be struggling to find like a grounded sense of confidence. Like
Yeah.
to be confident, it's almost like currently you have to find someone who has harmed you so that you can like stand up and tell them that so there's something
No,
funny
I
going
know.
on and I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a strange push and pull between these forces.
I mean, my theory about that is we live in a highly meritocratic society where the idea is that you can become whoever you want to be with just enough effort and you have nobody to blame but yourself. But you can blame your parents, and you can blame. So, so, if you have depression or anxiety or other forms of mental illness or dysfunction, it's a way to relieve yourself of shame. And I think we live in a highly shame-based society. So having an identity, it can also be kind of a bid for empathy, kind of like, well, you should
Yeah.
care about me. You should treat me with some degree of empathy because I have this affliction. The problem is that the research shows that if you are too identified with your diagnosis, you actually don't do as well in life. So it
Right.
doesn't really, even though it may tie you to a kind of a community and you can get some kind of nurturance from that. It doesn't ultimately serve you because then your life becomes oriented around, both affirming that identity and also protecting yourself from those who might make those symptoms worse, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when we add a lot of cultural currency to somebody's status as a victim,
Yeah.
inevitably, consciously or otherwise, it incentivizes people to really emphasize ways that they have been victimized, or sometimes even, I don't want to say fabricate because it sounds very intentional, but I think sometimes memory can be quite subjective. I'm sure you know
Mhm.
way more about this, but there are sometimes in estrangement cases, false memories of like abuse that is, you are able to substantiate that it did not happen. And
Mhm.
yet those narratives become really powerful. And interestingly, like I work with a lot of families, and even sometimes kids will admit that this happens, where the young person is, really embedded in an online group where all of the other young people are kind of sharing stories of how difficult their lives are. And sometimes kids will really either embellish or completely make up,
Mhm.
abuses that did not happen. And then when confronted about it, kind of admit like, I know that wasn't true, but I just wanted to like fit in, or I just wanted to feel like I was part of this group. So,
Yeah.
being a victim or having been um, harmed or oppressed, it's part of the, I think to some degree, the adolescent, desire to feel like a misunderstood. There's something glorified a little bit about being,
Right.
mistreated by, the world, and then you kind of rise above it, like a very kind of hero's journey situation. But
Agreed. Yeah.
it can be very tempting if that's like the way young people are kind of feeling validated and supported. And I'm sure in a lot of the online estrangement groups, if you share a story that either happened or didn't happen or somewhat happened, or even whether it happened or not is irrelevant, you're going to get a lot of support.
Oh, there's
And
no question. Yeah. Every time I write an article, particularly if it's at all endorsing the parent's perspective, it's just like a pile-on from the estranged adult child saying, well, my mother would say the same thing, but she was a narcissist. And then every, bunch of other people pile into that. It's almost like people feel threatened by the idea that maybe your decision to estrange wasn't such a good thing to do, and so they kind of have to jump into the fray of saying that, because I've noticed on online communities, if somebody starts to say something like, well, maybe I'm going to reconcile with my parents, they actually get met with hostility, or particularly if they
yeah.
push up back against somebody else. Well, how do you know that's true? Then they're really treated like outcasts. And is there a
Oh
similar
yeah.
thing that that happens in the trans online communities, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's such a strange rabbit hole to go down, but it's amazing how many parallels there are. I mean, if you are in a Reddit space or a Discord server with other trans people or gender dysphoric people, and you say, "Hey, I think maybe this was not really right for me, or this might have been a mistake. I think I'm gonna step away from this." You are gonna get met with not necessarily like attacks on your character, but like, oh no, have you been brainwashed by someone? Or
Yeah,
why are you thinking this way? Who has gotten to you? Or, oh no, if you do this, you are most likely going to sink back into horrible depression. Or you might hear that same threat
yeah.
about suicide. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
think people intend to be threatening another person, but if you earnestly believe this black and white way of thinking, you might be really nervous and you want to encourage this person not to make a big mistake. So
Right,
this is why black and white thinking can be such a challenge, because I bet
right.
similarly, if you think reconciling with your parents is going to plunge you into another kind of depressive episode, of course you don't want your friend to reconcile with their parents.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's so much anxiety in our culture, and I think these communities, their goal is to reduce anxiety with certainty, but certainty isn't necessarily the right thing to do.
I
And
know.
I mean, I think one of the problems, it's kind of like what we were talking about before, that yeah, you can't just be a tomboy or a feminine boy without being gay or something like that. That everything has to have a kind of a certain sort of an identity. But the other problem I think is that there's sort of too many options of identity, right? I mean, it's like there's so many different things you could be. I mean, even in the LGBT community, there's like 5 or 10 other aspects of that you could be identifying with. And I think that also just makes things much more confusing than if it's sort of much more straightforward. However much having a much more straightforward, limited, constrained series of choices of identity may be leaving out certain people. There's also a certain kind of a clarity and reassurance that can come with that doesn't come, I think, with so much fluidity around identity.
Yeah, and I think it depends a lot on, the young person's developmental age, what's going on in their context. I work with a lot of families who, let's say their kid is like 12 or 13, very young, and has kind of been thrust into the possibility of like, multiple choices they have to make. Or maybe they believe that to be their true self, they have to kind of throw their whole life into disarray and make all these massive proclamations. A lot of parents who have been tiptoeing around this and giving the child a lot of leadway, when they say, honey, I love you very much, but you're just a kid. These are huge decisions. We're going to park this right now and just focus on, your schoolwork or whatever. They often anticipate, oh no, my kid's never going to talk to me again. They're going to be so upset. But I
Yeah.
find the opposite. They
Oh,
will
interesting.
call me and say, Sasha, I'm shocked. My daughter didn't even, challenge me on that. She didn't put up a fight. And the rest of the day, she was like stuck to my hip. She wouldn't leave me alone. She was so snuggly. She was very attached. So, I mean,
Interesting.
I think young kids need some sort of groundwork and framing to
Hmm.
keep them feeling safe. Now, of course,
Yeah.
that approach isn't necessarily how you deal with like an 18-year-old, but I mean,
Right.
the age of the child makes a huge difference on what is an appropriate response here. What is the dance that's happening between a child and their parent at
Hmm.
11 versus 15 versus 25? These are all
Yeah.
different stories.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That the
Yeah.
parents' certainty can kind of reduce the younger child's anxiety because they don't have to sort of figure it out all by themselves. The parents
Because
can.
it's a lot, like you
It's a
said, it's
lot.
a lot to
Yeah,
figure out. And
yeah.
I think too, I mean, I think we have to talk a little bit about the role of therapists in
Yes, let's
both
do
of
that.
these worlds.
Yeah.
I was listening to something really interesting the other day, and I thought about you because I knew we would be having this conversation. I was listening to an interview with a young actress. This is actually an interview in Arabic. I study Arabic, and so I
Oh,
watch a
cool.
lot of Egyptian content.
Oh, fun.
And she was talking about her upbringing, and she was talking about how when she was a kid, her father used pretty harsh kind of parenting tactics to try and keep her and her siblings in line, and how just devastated that made her feel. And she said, she would be at her school with her friends and she'd hear their fathers on the phone being like, "Hey, sweetie, how are you? How was your day?" And my dad was so tough on me and so strict on me. And she said for years, I could barely look him in the eye. And then she went to therapy. And she said that the therapist helped her, first of all, to understand how those childhood experiences were affecting her current struggles. And she also helped her to understand why her father did that. What was his upbringing like? Let's try to understand where he was coming from. And her therapist kind of encouraged her as an adult now to sit down with her father and have conversations and share with him her experience. And what ended up happening is, the dad took it in, he was able to apologize, and their dynamic really changed. And what this young actress said is, if it wasn't for therapy, I don't think I would have a relationship with my dad today.
Interesting. Yeah.
That blew my mind because it's the exact opposite of what a lot of therapists are doing now here.
Right. Well, exactly. Yeah. If this happened to the average Western, particularly American therapist, would be like, "Oh yeah, you were emotionally abused by your father, and that's why you have so much social anxiety, and you'll be much better off if you just cut off contact with him." And that's a very assertive, self-caring thing to do. No, I mean, I think I love that the therapists have that position because it invites compassion for the parent, not contempt.
Yeah.
And I think the average Western approach, particularly American approach, invites contempt for the parent.
And it encourages, an improved relationship with, which I think is the whole point. I mean, we have American therapists who encourage cutoff because they think it will improve the well-being of the individual client, but actually improved relationships improve the well-being of the client. Now, is it always possible? No. I mean, I have people in my direct family who are estranged, and I know that there's no way that they could ever achieve that healthier relationship with their parents. So I know that sometimes it's impossible. But I would say many of the cases that have emerged in the last 10 years or so, reconciliation, improved relationships are possible if parents are given a chance.
Yeah, well, I 100% agree. And parents also have to be given a certain amount of patience that they don't. I mean, I'm impressed that this young person's, if they were young, the dad was able to kind of accept the daughter's narrative because, a lot of them wouldn't be and would just sort of refute it. But I think, my wish is that younger generations would have more acceptance and tolerance that if a parent doesn't get it right away, it's kind of a tough thing to get and to understand and to integrate that you failed your child or you hurt your child in ways that you didn't know. And the dad, may well have thought he was raising his daughter to be whatever, tough, assertive in a hostile world. And, there's so many ways that the dad could do that. Or maybe he was just impatient because he was exhausted from working and supporting the family again. But we have so much power as therapists to move things either way. And I love what you just said about it's actually relationships in general that are going to create mental health and happiness and resilience, not becoming more and more rigid with our boundaries and our limits and that kind of thing. And I think so much of Western psychology is oriented around my precious boundaries.
Why do you think therapists in our field have kind of moved in that direction? Like, why have they bought this?
Yeah, if you look at surveys prior to the 1960s, that really wasn't the orientation of therapy. It was much more towards making people fit in, be much more conformist and that kind of thing. The example I often give is if you were a 1950s housewife and you showed up to therapy complaining that you were unhappy as being a housewife and not having a career and just taking care of the children, you'd be given either an antidepressant or a sedative and sent on your merry way with a diagnosis. Since the 1960s, we became much more oriented around identity and health and individuality, personal rights and individual rights. So therapy has kind of shifted as well. The early 1960s therapists, were the ones who did the whole thing that was, it was very self-oriented thing, but it was still a more communitarian kind of a perspective. But over the 21st century, it just became much more oriented around and that around what the sociologist Alison Pugh calls therapists became detachment brokers, helping people detach from earlier feelings of obligation or duty or responsibility or guilt. And all those feelings are pathologized. Whereas in most societies, yeah, you should feel guilty. You do owe your parents something, right? You should feel some feelings of duty towards your parents. Whereas in Western societies, in the U.S. in particular, because we have the highest rates of individualism, therapists have just kind of followed the cultural lead. We don't really operate separate. We don't really have a healthier orientation in some ways, at least many therapists. The field, I don't think yet has arguably a healthier orientation against the more toxic aspects of individualism. So I think that's kind of what happened.
Yeah. Is there kind of like a parallel branch of therapy? So, for example, there are some clinicians who are gender therapists, and on their websites they say like, I affirm, like that's what I do. Like it doesn't matter who you are, you come in, I'm going to affirm you, I'm going to write a letter for you to get hormones. Like there's no differentiation between different patients. Is there any version of that for estrangement? Like I help you cut off contact with your parents. Like, is there any therapist that kind of advertises themselves that way?
I don't know anybody advertises themselves that way per se, but I think there's plenty who's, I think the book Emotionally Immature Parents, I mean, she would argue she's not pro estrangement, but the title alone is going to green light. As soon as you diagnose a parent, you greenlit an estrangement. You've just depersonalized that parent. You've just made it seem like they're kind of beyond repair or redress and that kind of thing. Sites like, the mother wound, or I help people with narcissistic mothers, and, all these sort of areas of so-called specialization, they all kind of, the implication is the thing that matters most is you and your feelings and protecting you, and I'm going to do whatever I can. And I mean, arguably that's a good thing, right? We want to help the people who are sitting in front of us, help them to feel cared about and seen and heard and protected, but not at the extent of, cutting off relationships that really may serve them, and that will be an enormous loss if it doesn't serve them. And I think it's tied to Amy Shallot's work. She's a sociologist at University of Massachusetts, and she has this great concept called that she calls American individualism adversarial individualism. And she contrasts it. She's a Dutch American, and she contrasts it with Dutch parenting practices, which she describes as interpersonal individualism. And so her famous. Did you read her book? Not Under
No,
My
but this is super interesting. I'm going to read it.
It's a
I
good
love
book.
this cultural stuff. It's so interesting.
Yeah, it's very important. So in Dutch parenting, they raised her book was called Not Under My Roof. And it's called that because she did a comparison of Dutch and American parents. And Dutch parents, by the time the kid is 16, they can have a sleepover with a boyfriend or girlfriend. They can have wine at dinner with the family. And there's a term for it. I won't butcher Dutch by trying to say what it is, but it means cozy togetherness. So, the idea that you can, and their theory is, you kind of raise your children, you're helping them. They have a sleepover so you can talk about what it was like. Was it awkward? How did it feel? And of course, in Holland, there's, enormous sex education support and contraceptions available and, things on the buses and that kind of thing. She contrasts that with American individualism, which she calls adversarial individualism. So it's called Not Under My Roof because most American parents, the idea that you can let your kid spend the night with their girlfriend or boyfriend at 16 or 17 or 18, or have drinks with the family at dinner in late adolescence, not under my roof, right? And so the idea is that the individual becomes an individual in this adversarial relationship with a parent. So part of what therapists are doing is kind of helping them. Our whole emphasis on separation, individuation, autonomy, these are the big, gold standards in Western psychology. I think that's a lot of why therapists have this orientation. Plus, they've kind of drunk the Freudian Kool-Aid that repression means that you can forget traumatic experiences, which isn't really shown by the evidence. So
Yeah, that's a very interesting area that I've studied a bunch too. I mean, the kind of reconstruction of of memory and whether you can just kind of like entirely forget huge aspects of your childhood. It's very interesting. There's a memory hole podcast that is, I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't heard
Jenna
of it.
Martin has created amazing, the memory
really?
hole. Yeah, you'll really like it, and I think your listeners would like it.
Oh, good.
Not that you should ever divert from Dr. Coleman's podcast. You should just
No,
24/7 be
You should
glued to
spend all
Dr.
of your time
Coleman's
here.
podcast only.
Exactly right, and our episode in particular will certainly bear
just
repeated
play it on
listens, right?
repeat
Over and
forever.
over. Yeah, exactly. You'll learn something new each time. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about with Sasha, but I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of the things I wanted to talk about. Is there anything that we've left on the table that you were hoping we would get to?
Well, I mean, one thing that just is so funny, I remember many years ago, I was going through a particularly challenging time with my own parents. And I picked up that book about emotionally immature parents.
Oh, you did? Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I remember reading a few pages, and there was one part where she said, it was like unequivocal. She said, if you struggle with, A, B, or C things, it's because your emotionally immature parents, didn't sufficiently like nurture you or something. Right. And I actually got so offended and so defensive. I was like, my mom and dad are good people. What is she talking about? Like, part of me actually got really defensive, even though I was genuinely annoyed by them at that moment.
Yeah, sure.
And I ended up not finishing the book. Mm-hmm. But I think, like, if I, and I have journals full of, like, stuff that I wrote when I was, like, 14 or 15, so angry at my parents. Had I read that book then, oh my God, I would have been toast. I would have been, that relationship would have been toast.
They would have been toast, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really unfortunate that such rigid, prescriptive framings of things can land on a person when they're particularly vulnerable or like really feeling wounded. And man, that's just going to inflame all of that tension. So it's so sad.
No, I had the same reaction to that book, and so many of those books that are out there these days. Well, do you have this problem? That means you had this kind of parenting. Like, no, it doesn't mean that at all. It's sort of we're making parents so much more responsible. The research is like parents account for maybe 25% of how we turn. It's low. It's not.
Yeah,
even,
I was
not
shocked
50%.
when I learned that. I was really that like blew my mind.
Right? I mean, it makes sense. 50% is genetics, then it's your sibling relationships, then it's your peer relationships, then it's random good luck, then it's random bad luck, then it's cohort, the generation you're growing up in, right? It's not all parents, though. But if you show up to therapy with particularly a so-called trauma-informed therapist these days, and who's not particularly well-trained, that's where they're going to go. Well, how are you traumatized? It's because if you have these kind of symptoms, it means you have this kind of parent. And it's like, no, it doesn't mean that you cannot reverse engineer from your present symptoms into your past reliably.
That's right.
Because somebody could actually grow up with a pretty good parenting, certainly normal parenting, and be pretty screwed up. Sorry for being so unclinical, but they could have enormous problems.
Yep. Totally. There's no formula. It's no formula. Human beings are complicated. We barely understand the brain. I mean, it's the most complicated object on planet Earth. So to be able to say unequivocally that those things equal one another, it's so wrong.
It's so wrong. It's so problematic. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sasha. It was such a pleasure, and it was such a pleasure to have you at the Tahoe retreat. Like I said, everybody loved your presence and your talks and your ideas, and so I hope.
Thank you. I loved being there. It was awesome. It was so great that you invited me and recommended me. It was a great time and difficult, beautiful, wonderful, like really moving. So I really glad to be a part of it and glad to talk with you again today, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. And how can people reach you, Sasha? What's the best way?
Well, I think most likely my Substack. So if you go to Substack and just search Sasha Ayad, you will find me there. I actually have a piece coming out tomorrow.
Substack, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I'm writing a little bit about how I learned at the mother's estrangement retreat that affirming your child doesn't necessarily prevent estrangement. So I have a whole piece coming out about that tomorrow. And you can find everything about me there. I have links to my parent group and my consulting work and all kinds of things. So that's the best place.
Good. All right. Lovely to see you. We'll be in touch. Take
Lovely
care,
to see you
everybody.
too. Thank you.
And if you found this helpful, please follow the podcast and leave a review. It helps other people find the show who could benefit from it. If you want to learn more about my work, you can visit me at www.drjoshuacoleman.com. That is drjoshuacoleman.com, or subscribe to my Substack, Family Troubles. Hope to see you in one of those places soon. Take care.